The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. Act 1. The Letter. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, which was the kind of ordinary day that changes everything. Helen was at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, still in her robe, reading nothing in particular, when the mail slot clicked and a small stack of envelopes slid onto the hallway floor. She didn't hurry. At 67, she had learned that most things worth responding to could wait a few minutes while a person finished their coffee. There were two bills, a catalog she hadn't asked for, and a cream-colored envelope with her name written in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. Not a return address, just her name and her street, in careful, slightly formal cursive that belonged to someone who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. She opened it at the table. It was from a woman named Dorothy Marsh. The name meant nothing to Helen at first, but the second paragraph stopped her completely. Dorothy wrote that she was clearing out her late mother's belongings after a long illness, and that among her mother's papers she had found a collection of letters. The letters were addressed to someone named Frances. Dorothy's mother had been Frances, and the letters, spanning nearly 40 years, were signed simply with the letter H. Dorothy had done some searching, she wrote, and believed that H might be Helen, Helen Mercer, now Helen Bourne. If this was right, she wanted Helen to know that the letters existed and that she was welcome to have them if she wished. Helen set the letter down on the table. Frances. She had not heard that name in 22 years. She sat very still for a long time. Outside, the neighbor's sprinkler started up with its familiar rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. A car passed, the refrigerator hummed, all the small sounds of an ordinary Wednesday going about its business, indifferent to the fact that Helen had just been handed something that required her to sit very quietly and breathe. Frances Coleman had been her closest friend for 38 years. They had met as young women at a seaside town where both of them had summer jobs the year they were 23. Frances was working at a small hotel. Helen was working at the gift shop 2 doors down. They had recognized each other immediately as kindred spirits in the way that occasionally happens between certain people, that immediate sense of being known without explanation. They had stayed friends across marriages and children and moves and all the distances that life arranges between people. They had written letters to each other for decades, even after email became the simpler option, because Frances believed that a letter was different in kind from a message. A letter required you to sit down and commit. A letter was a visit on paper. Frances had died 22 years ago, ovarian cancer, fast and relentless. Helen had been at her bedside. She had held her hand at the end. It was the worst thing she had ever witnessed, and also, in some way, she had spent years trying to articulate, the most profound. She had not spoken Frances's name in a long time, not because she had forgotten her, because some things, when held privately, stay whole. She had been afraid that speaking the name would somehow dissolve what she was keeping. She read Dorothy's letter twice more. Then she went to find her good stationery. She was going to write back. She was going to do more than that. Dorothy had mentioned that she lived in a town about 3 hours away, the same coastal town where the letters had apparently been kept, the same town where Helen and Frances had both lived, briefly in their early 20s. Helen had not been back there in over 40 years. She thought about this while she wrote her reply. She thought about it through the afternoon and into the evening. She made herself dinner and ate it at the table and looked out the window at the garden going gold in the late light. and thought about the particular quality of the air in that seaside town, the way it smelled of salt and pine and something else she had never been able to name exactly. By the time she went to bed, she had made up her mind. She would go. Act 2. The Town. The town was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was larger. Helen drove in from the north, the way she had always come in those early years when she and Frances would take the long route deliberately because it gave you the better view of the harbor. And the harbor was still there, still beautiful, still holding its small fleet of fishing boats and pleasure crafts with the same unhurried patience. The water was the same deep blue-gray that she had tried for years to describe to people who hadn't seen it and never quite managed. She had arranged to meet Dorothy Marsh at a small cafe near the waterfront at 11 in the morning. She arrived early and sat at a window table with tea and looked out at the boats. She was trying to remember the specific texture of being 23 in this town. It came back in fragments rather than as a continuous thing, the particular creak of the floorboards in the gift shop where she worked, the smell of the breakfast place where she and Frances used to go on Sunday mornings, the only morning both of them had free, the sound of the foghorn at night, which she had found romantic at first, and then simply familiar, and then, by the end of that summer, like a voice she would miss. She and Frances had rented a small apartment together that summer, 2 rooms above a hardware store, with windows that faced the water. They stayed up too late most nights talking about everything, about the men they had known and the ones they hoped to know, about the kinds of women they wanted to become, about books and films and the question of what a life was supposed to feel like from the inside. Frances had very strong opinions on all of these subjects. Helen had fewer opinions but better questions. They balanced each other perfectly. Dorothy arrived exactly on time. She was a woman in her early 40s, dark-haired, with her mother's eyes. Helen recognized the eyes immediately and felt something move in her chest. They shook hands. They ordered more tea. There was a brief, careful period of getting acquainted, 2 strangers connected by someone they had both loved, feeling their way toward ease. Then Dorothy reached into her bag and set a bundle on the table between them. The letters were tied with a piece of faded blue ribbon. There were perhaps 50 of them, Helen estimated. 50 letters across 38 years. She touched the top envelope without picking it up. She kept them all, Helen said. In a box in her closet, Dorothy said, along with a few photographs and a small notebook that I think was a journal, though she never showed it to me. She paused. She talked about you, you know, not all the time, but when she did, it was with a particular kind of warmth, the way you talk about someone you consider essential. Helen looked at the letters. We met here, she said, right here in this town, the summer we were 23. Dorothy nodded. She had known this from the letters. There was a lighthouse, Helen said, just up the coast a bit. We used to walk up there on evenings when neither of us had to work. Frances loved it. She said it was the most honest building she had ever seen. Just one purpose, just this one clear thing it was built to do. She smiled at the memory. She proposed that we write each other letters instead of calling on the phone, Helen continued. This was before email. Calling long distance was expensive, but she said it wasn't about the cost. She said she wanted the kind of communication that required you to stop moving, to actually sit down and think before you spoke. She looked up at Dorothy. That was Frances. She was always trying to get people to slow down. She was the same with us, Dorothy said quietly, right until the end. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a gull landed on the railing of the wharf and looked in at them with its bright, indifferent eye, then lifted away. After Dorothy left, Helen sat alone at the table with the bundle of letters. She did not open them yet. She simply held them in her lap and looked out at the harbor. She thought about what it meant that Frances had kept every single one, 50 letters, some of them from hard years, years when Helen hadn't been sure she was writing anything worth keeping. The years when her marriage had been difficult, when her children were young and she was exhausted in ways she didn't know how to explain. She had written Frances through all of it, and Frances had kept all of it, and now here it was in Helen's lap, her own life handed back to her in her own handwriting. In the afternoon she walked up the coast to the lighthouse. It was still there. Of course it was. Lighthouses outlast most things. This one had been restored at some point, its white paint fresh, its lights still functioning, though now automated rather than tended by an actual keeper. There was a small plaque explaining its history. She didn't read it. She stood at the base and looked up at the tower, and then out at the water, and thought about Frances saying it was the most honest building she had ever seen. Just one purpose, just this one clear thing. She sat on a rock near the base and opened the first letter from the bundle. It was dated nearly 40 years ago, the first letter she had written to Frances after they had both gone home at the end of that summer. She read her own words from 40 years ago and felt, with some surprise, that she recognized herself in them. Younger, less settled, more uncertain about nearly everything, but recognizably herself. She wrote about missing the town, about how the smell of the ocean had stayed with her on the drive home, as if she had taken some of it with her, about how she didn't know yet what her life was supposed to be, but that the summer had made her feel that it was possible to find out. She had forgotten writing this. She had forgotten this version of herself, standing at the beginning of everything, not yet knowing how things would go. She read it with the tenderness you would feel for a stranger who reminded you of someone you loved. She sat by the lighthouse for a long time, reading letters, while the light moved across the water and the afternoon turned toward evening. Act 3: What Remains. On her second day in the town, Helen went back to the street where she and Frances had lived that summer. The hardware store was still there, which surprised her. She had expected it to be something else by now, a boutique or a restaurant or a real estate office, but it was still a hardware store, and above it, the two windows that had been their apartment windows still looked out over the street. She stood on the pavement and looked up at them. She tried to remember the specific feeling of being up there, of waking up early and making coffee in the small kitchen and hearing Frances still asleep in the other room, the particular comfort of knowing someone was nearby. She and Frances had not lived together before or after that summer, but for those 3 months they had inhabited the same small space, and it had felt, in retrospect, like a gift that neither of them fully appreciated at the time because they were too young to understand that such things were rare. She bought a small bag of nails in the hardware store, not because she needed nails, but because it seemed right to give something to a place that had held something of hers. In the afternoon she sat in the small park near the waterfront and read more letters. Frances's voice came through the letters Dorothy had given her, or rather, Helen heard her own letters differently now, knowing what Frances had been living on the other side of the correspondence. Some years had been hard for Frances, too, a difficult pregnancy, a period when her marriage had been uncertain, the loss of her own mother. Helen had known all of this at the time, had written through all of it with her, but reading it now in one continuous document, she saw the shape of Frances's life more clearly than she ever had while inside it. There was a letter from about 20 years into the friendship that stopped Helen completely. She read it twice on the park bench, the letter shifting slightly in the breeze from the harbor. In that letter, Helen had apparently been going through a particularly hard time, though she couldn't quite reconstruct now what the difficulty had been, and she had written to Frances something that she did not remember writing. She had written that she sometimes felt as though she was only partly real, that without someone knowing her full history, she felt as though she might become vague at the edges, and she had written that it was Frances, specifically, who kept her solid. Knowing that Frances was somewhere holding the full story of her kept her from feeling like she might dissolve. She did not remember writing this, but she recognized the feeling completely. She thought about those words for the rest of the afternoon. She walked along the waterfront with the bundle of letters under her arm and thought about what it meant to be held in someone else's memory, to have someone carrying the long view of you. She had written it about Frances. Frances had kept the letter for 20 years, and now Frances was gone, and here Helen was, reading it back to herself. There was something in this that she couldn't quite name, some quality of being returned to herself, as though the letters were Frances's way of continuing to hold her story even after she was gone, as though the keeping of them was its own kind of answer to what Helen had once feared. She went back to the lighthouse in the evening. The sun was going down over the water to the west, turning everything amber and rose. She sat on the same rock as the previous afternoon. The lighthouse began to flash its slow, regular rhythm as the light faded, exactly as it had done for over a century, exactly as it had done when she and Frances had sat here in their 20s and talked about the kinds of women they wanted to become. She thought about the kinds of women they had become. Frances had become a woman of great stillness and great warmth. She had raised 3 children with patience. She had worked as a librarian for 30 years, which suited her perfectly because she believed in books with a seriousness bordering on devotion. She had kept her friendships carefully as if they were something that required tending. She had written 50 letters over 38 years. Helen had become someone who asked good questions and listened well. She had raised 2 children and helped raise several grandchildren. She had been married for 30 years and widowed for 6. She had built a life that was quieter than she had imagined at 23 and richer in ways she could not have predicted. She had loved Frances in the way that 2 people love each other when they have known each other through everything and found each other essentially good. She thought about what she would do with the letters. She could not simply file them away. That felt wrong. She thought about writing them up somehow, organizing them, turning them into something that could be given to Frances's children and grandchildren, a record of their mother's interior life across 4 decades, seen through the eyes of someone who had known her from the beginning. Dorothy had Frances's letters to Helen as well. Together, they would make something complete. It was the kind of project that would take time, the kind that required sitting down and committing, the kind Frances would have approved of entirely. The lighthouse flashed its slow, patient rhythm across the water. Helen sat on the rock until it was full dark, which was later than she had intended. She was not cold. The evening was mild, the air carrying that smell of salt and pine and the other things she had never been able to name. She decided now that the other thing was simply the smell of water from this particular body of water on this particular stretch of coast, and that it had no name because it was specific rather than general, the kind of thing you could only carry in your body rather than in a word. She had carried it, she realized, for 40 years without knowing it. It had been in her all this time. On the drive home the following morning, she stopped at a cafe she didn't know and had breakfast alone and wrote in a small notebook she had brought. She wrote about Francis. She wrote about the lighthouse. She wrote about the letter she had sent 20 years ago and found again on a park bench. She wrote about what it felt like to be returned to yourself. She was not sure who she was writing it for. Maybe for Dorothy, who had her mother's eyes. Maybe for her own children, who knew her only from a certain point onward. Maybe just for herself, to make it real by putting it into words, to give it the weight of a letter. She wrote until her coffee was cold, then drove the rest of the way home in the quiet of mid-morning. The letters sat in a box on the passenger seat beside her, tied with their faded blue ribbon. 50 letters, 38 years, a friendship that had kept two women solid and whole and known across all the distance that life arranges. She drove home on roads she knew well, through towns she had seen in all seasons, into the city that had been hers for decades. She pulled into her street and parked in front of her house and sat for a moment looking at the garden, which needed some attention but was still beautiful in the fall light. She brought the letters inside and set them on the kitchen table next to her coffee cup from this morning, still unwashed. Then she went to find her good stationery. She was going to write to Dorothy. She was going to write a real letter, not an email. She was going to write it by hand in careful cursive and seal it in a cream-colored envelope and put it in the mail. Frances would have wanted that. She sat down at the table and uncapped her pen and thought for a moment about where to begin. Outside, the garden was going gold in the afternoon light. The neighbor's sprinkler had started up again, back and forth, back and forth. The refrigerator hummed, all the small sounds of an ordinary day, holding within them, as ordinary days always do, something that was not ordinary at all. She began to write. Dear Dorothy, thank you for finding me. There is so much I want to tell you about your mother. She was one of the most careful people I have ever known, careful in the best sense of the word, full of care for the things and people she chose to love. I have been thinking about where to begin, and I think I will begin at the beginning, which is a small seaside town in a summer when we were both 23 years old and the world seemed enormous, and we were not yet afraid of that. I hope you will sit down with this letter somewhere comfortable because it may take a while. Some things require time to tell properly. Frances always said so, and she was right about most things. She wrote until the afternoon went to evening, and the garden turned from gold to shadow, and the street outside grew quiet. The lighthouse somewhere up the coast sent its slow light out across the dark water, as it had always done, asking nothing in return, needing nothing but the simple fact of the dark to be useful in. It was enough. It was, in the end, more than enough. The end